How do you blend watercolor pencils and create transitions in which one color turns gradually into another color? Is it the same as when you're using traditional colored pencils like Prismacolor pencils, or does it work differently? In this video, I'm going to be sharing 4 super helpful exercises that will help you with your blending techniques when it comes to painting with watercolor pencils. I'll be sharing what I like doing to layer color in order to change temperature to make a color look lighter or darker, how I like creating gradients in which the color is turning into the whiteness of the paper, how I like creating gradients in which a color is turning into another color, and I'm also going to be sharing how I like using the brush application technique to create gradients. I would highly recommend working on these exercises, whether you're just getting started with this medium or you're a little bit more advanced and you're just looking to improve your techniques. But before jumping into the good stuff, I do want to make it super clear that watercolor pencils are quite different from traditional colored pencils. Even though at first glance they look quite similar, what's inside of them is different. So their usage is different and the end results are also going to be different. So if you expect the blending to work exactly the same as when you're using traditional wax-based colored pencils, you're in for a bit of a surprise. You see, in their core, traditional colored pencils have a wax binder along with the pigment. And so to blend color when using traditional colored pencils, what we do is layer enough pigment on, we apply pressure and friction. You can bring in specific types of blenders as well, and other artists like bringing in things like turpentine and odorless mineral spirits and blending with a paintbrush. You're able to arrive at much smoother results much more easily once you get the hang of this process, and colored pencils usually have more of a shinier finish, a shinier look. On the other hand, what's in the core of watercolor pencils is a mixture of pigment and gum arabic. It's the same thing in traditional watercolor paint. And what this type of binder allows watercolor pencil pigment to do is to be activated with water. And so the way that we do our blending when using watercolor pencils is we bring in water and a paintbrush. There is a certain amount of blending that you can do purely through using the pencil without bringing in water and a brush, but you're likely not going to arrive at smooth results and you're going to have that texture left behind by the pencil application. This said, even if we bring in water and a paintbrush, because of the nature of watercolor pencils, it's going to be very, very hard to arrive at completely smooth results as you would with traditional colored pencils. Also, when compared to the shiny, very smooth finish that traditional colored pencils lead to, with watercolor pencils, those end results usually look a lot more matte. All right, so with all of that information out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into today's exercises. All right, so before jumping in, I just want to briefly talk about the paper and the watercolor pencils that you're going to be seeing me use in this video. To begin, the paper that I'm using is cold pressed paper from Strathmore. This paper is 140 pounds in thickness or in weight, and it is 100% cotton. Being cold pressed paper, it definitely has some texture to it. If you're looking for less texture and more of an even look when you're working with watercolor pencils, I would definitely recommend working on hot press watercolor paper because that's much smoother and it's going to enable you to apply that pigment in a more even way. The more textured your paper is, the more the tip of your watercolor pencil is going to skip over that tooth and the color is not going to be applied as evenly. So that's just something to consider. In terms of my watercolor pencils, I'm going to be bringing in a few different pencils from my Gold Faber Aqua set from Faber-Castell. This set of exercises can be done with any colors, but I would recommend that especially in the exercises where we're creating gradients where one color turns into another color gradually, you use colors that are analogous in the color wheel. meaning colors that are next to each other in the color wheel, so that those transitions can be easier to create. Just have in mind that whenever you start blending complementary colors, meaning opposites in the color wheel, or simply colors that are very different from each other, you can very easily start desaturating the color, arriving at a color that you weren't actually looking for, or even arriving at muddy results. And it's going to be harder to create nice looking gradients. And this isn't to say that desaturated or muted colors are wrong and that you should never use them. This is just for the purpose of these exercises. All right, so the first thing that I'm going to be practicing right here is I'm going to be layering two colors together. And this is an important technique to practice because sometimes when you're working on a watercolor pencil piece, you're going to want to brighten an area of your painting, darken an area of your painting, or simply change the color temperature to make an area look warmer or cooler as you're moving forward. So I choose a purple to work with right here. And what I am doing is I'm just filling up a couple of rectangles that I've created for myself with an even layer of this purple. I am making sure to apply enough pigment on my paper so that we can really blend this color with the next one that I'm going to be placing on top and really see how these two colors affect each other and what is the result of these color combinations that I'm going to be doing. And we can see how they compare with the swatch of the one single purple that I have created right here on this scrap piece of watercolor paper to my right. I'm continuing to stay mindful of the pressure that I'm exerting, and I'm doing my best to keep that layer of color consistent and as uniform as possible in these rectangles. But you can definitely see how the tooth or texture of this cold press paper is creating some visual texture. Little white specks of paper are visible here and there throughout this rectangle where the color didn't quite make it into that little groove, if you will, or where a very small amount of that color was applied because of that texture of the paper, creating a bit of a mottled look. Some of this texture is going to disappear when I activate this pigment with water and a brush. So I finished adding in my base purple color in both of these rectangles, and what I am doing now is I'm adding my second color over my purple in this first rectangle, and for my second color in this one, I chose a red. I wanted to alter or change the color temperature in this purple, in this first one, and make it warmer and redder, so more of a red purple. For the second one, I chose a blue. I want to turn that first purple into more of a blue purple and change the temperature of it so that it becomes cooler. For the most part, if you layer a darker color over a lighter color, you're going to be darkening it. And if you layer a lighter color, especially if it's a brighter color like a yellow, you're going to be lightening the color underneath. But you do have to make sure that you apply enough pigment to see a difference. Okay, so I'm done with my layering, and first I'm going to be activating the plain purple all on its own right here on the scrap piece of watercolor paper so that we can see the difference. I remove all of that color from my paintbrush bristles and I go ahead and get started with my color activation in this first rectangle. So this is the red purple. To activate watercolor pencil pigment, you need a very small amount of water at a time, and make sure that you're running your paintbrush bristles over that color gently. As I continue activating this combo of pigments, you can see how these two colors, the purple and the red, are blending into each other, creating a red purple. Once I was done with that first rectangle, I removed all of that color from my paintbrush bristles, and it was time to do my color activation in the second rectangle. As I do this activation, you can see how the purple is blending with the blue that I placed on top, which leads to more of a blue purple, and it looks quite different from the first. And both of these look very different from the single color swatch that I created with the purple all on its own. Okay, so let's move on to the second exercise, and this is going to be an important technique to know about and practice as well, Because when you're using watercolor pencils, no white is actually required. We're bringing in the whiteness and the brightness of the paper to stand in place for our highlights and to help us develop those light value areas. Very similarly to what we do when we're working with traditional watercolor paint. And so we need to practice creating gradients where the color turns gradually into the whiteness of the paper. So I'm going to show you how to do that. I picked a couple of different colors for these gradients, and I go ahead and get started with that first rectangle at the top. And the trick here is to apply more pigment on the area where you want the darker color or where you want to saturate that color more, and apply less pigment in areas where you actually want that brightness of the paper to show through, or where the highlight area would be, for example. All this means is that you need to cover up more paper in those darker areas and cover up less and less paper as you make your way toward those lightest value areas. And this requires a good amount of fine motor skills and practice, but essentially what I am doing is I am applying a little bit more pressure in the darkest area, and then I am releasing that pressure as I make my way into the lighter value sections, leaving the rightmost edge of that rectangle free of pigment. And you can see how I am applying my pigment in layers. I don't expect myself to create a perfect gradient on the first go, and I use layering to darken and soften the transition until I arrive at a relatively smooth looking gradient that I like. And once I'm done applying my pigment on my paper, it was time to activate that color once again with water and my paintbrush. And what I am making sure to do is I am making sure to only take a small amount of water at a time from my container. You can see how much I am using that absorbent towel to my left to stay on top of water control and make sure that I'm not bringing out too much water onto my paper, because that is going to lead to a lot of splotchiness and undesired texture that you probably don't want. And I start by activating the color on the right, which is the lightest area, and I make my way with soft, gentle strokes toward the darkest area. Because if I start in the darkest area and I make my way toward the lightest area, I'm going to start pulling too much color into that lightest area where I want plenty of that paper to be left alone and shining through. I'm going to start covering up that white paper that I need for my lightest value areas. So I do my best to work from lights to darks, making sure that I am removing that pigment from my paintbrush bristles whenever necessary, because as I continue activating my color, more and more pigment is getting collected in my paintbrush bristles, and I can start painting in that color where I didn't want to. So it's very important to also pay attention to how you're pushing and pulling that color around, and to constantly remove that color from your paintbrush bristles whenever you don't want to be applying any more color in specific areas. And if I lighten those darkest areas, it's no issue because I will be working in layers. I will show you how I allow these initial layers to dry and then go back in to darken that darkest area and to soften transitions, and also to somewhat get rid of those little splotchy textures and effects that happen when I activated that color. But it is essential to allow that first layer to dry completely before attempting to go in to darken anything and make changes and correct little mistakes. So we'll be coming back to these initial gradients later. But for now, let's move on to exercise number 3, where we're also working on gradients, but these are color to color gradients, where one color turns into the next color gradually. So for these, as I was mentioning before, I made sure to choose sets of 2 colors that I knew would transition well into each other. For this first one, I chose pink and purple. And very similarly to what I was doing before with the color to white gradients, I'm doing a heavier application of color along the top and bottom edges of my rectangle. And as I am making my way down with the pink and up with the purple, I am releasing that pressure. As I make my way toward the bottom third with my pink or toward the upper third with my purple, I release that pressure completely so that the end section there is left completely free of color, with just the white paper showing. I just want my colors to intermix or blend in that central section. For my second one, I am using yellow and green. So you can see how I'm going in with my yellow first, and I'm making sure to saturate or create a heavier application of color along the top with that yellow, and then I release that pressure as I make my way down. Then I switch to the green and I do the same thing, but I make my way upward with my green, applying the green more heavily at the bottom. And you can see me working in layers as well, continuing to darken and saturate the color more along the top and bottom, and working on that transition until I arrive at something that looks good to me. And finally, for my third color to color gradient, I am using orange and red. I'm making my way down with the orange, making sure that I don't apply any orange in the bottom. Maybe the bottom third should have very little to no orange in it. I work in layers, darkening that upmost section, applying the orange more heavily in that area at the top. And then I do the same thing with the red, but I make my way up. You can work in as many layers as you need to until you arrive at a smooth looking transition. Make sure that you're continuing to pay attention to the pressure that you're exerting as you're applying your pigment, and practice releasing as you're making your way out of the more heavily saturated areas. And once I'm done there, it is time to get started with my color activation once again. So I take out my container and my paintbrush, and I make sure to work from light to dark. I should also say, quick note here, that as I am doing my color activation, I do my best to not overwork my paint and my paper. So if I see any little splotches or texture left behind, maybe I go in and very gently try to get rid of that texture with a couple of brush strokes. But if I'm not able to get rid of that texture or that splotchiness completely, I am not going to continue insisting, because that is going to lead to overworked results, and it's probably going to create even more splotchiness and more texture. And I would much rather allow this layer to dry and then come back in and apply more pigment and fix those little mistakes, or at least make them less noticeable with a second application. So all this to say, try not to fuss too much or worry too much about little splotches and textures and possible lines, because we will be going in with a second or even third layer, and things like that will become a lot less noticeable. Before jumping into exercise number 4, I'm going to go ahead and show you how I improve my gradients, how I darken areas, and even get rid of some little splotches and lines here and there by going in with a second layer of pigment. Everything is completely dry by this point in these first couple of exercises that I was working on. So using the same green, I do exactly the same thing that I was in the beginning. I layer more color on there, saturating and deepening that color in the leftmost edge that I want darkest, and I make my way toward the lightest area, releasing that pressure slowly so that the rightmost edge of that rectangle doesn't have any pigment in it. And then I do the same thing with my purple in that rectangle underneath. This layering process intensifies that color, and it can also definitely help you improve that transition, that gradient. And there is no specific number of layers that you should be working in when it comes to watercolor pencils. You can go in with as much layering as you want, but it is incredibly important that you allow that previous layer to dry completely if you've done activation with water and a paintbrush before going in and applying more color over it. Once I've done my second application of color, you're going to see how I once again bring out that paintbrush and my water, and I activate that pigment once again. This time though, I'm making my way toward the center. I first started at the left in those darkest areas, made my way toward the center, removed that color from my paintbrush bristles once I was at around the halfway point. Then I started making my way in from the right. And then I did the exact same thing with the rectangle underneath. And I wasn't very happy with how the transition or gradient in that middle section ended up in this purple one. So it's going to be a great opportunity for me to demo how I would fix that line that I end up with in the middle of that rectangle where I wanted that seamless transition. You're going to see me right around here going in with a few brush strokes and trying to fix that line that I end up with. But I know that I'm going to be much better off allowing this to dry and then going back in with a third application of color. I know that if I continue going in, I'm just going to make things worse. So I stop myself, I leave things be for now, and I go ahead and continue with the second application of color in my next exercises. So starting that second application of color in my pink to purple gradient, same exact thing that I was doing in layer number 1, perhaps applying a tiny bit more pressure with the second layer, especially in darkest, most saturated areas along the top and the bottom, but always staying mindful of that pressure that I'm exerting. Once I have my second layer of pigment on, I bring out my paintbrush and my water, and I first make my way down. I remove that pink from my paintbrush bristles, and then I make my way up with the purple. When it comes to this middle gradient, the yellow to green one, I'm just gonna apply that pigment with my watercolor pencils. And because I'm pretty happy with how this one is looking, things are looking pretty smooth, I'm just gonna leave this one as is without activating that color anymore. Which oftentimes when I'm actually working on a complete watercolor pencil piece, I don't activate that last application that I do with my watercolor pencils. I'll make sure to link to a few of my full watercolor pencil tutorials down below in the text section of this post so that you can see how I like going through my process. Okay, finishing up with the orange to red gradient here, I apply both of my colors again, and then I go ahead and do my activation. And with this one, all I have to do is make my way down with the orange. I think this gradient is looking fine as is, so I'm gonna stop myself from going in with unnecessary color activation and unnecessary brush strokes. While I was doing this work in my third exercises, the purple to white gradient was already dry, so I'm able to go in with my third layer to fix that line that I was talking about before. I work on that transition in the middle, and you're going to notice that that line becomes a lot less visible. Oftentimes, even though I'm really just interested in fixing that middle portion of the gradient, it's helpful to redo or start in the darkest area and make your way down again. So in other words, it's helpful to go over the entire thing, if possible with one single go. Let's jump into the fourth and final exercise, which is the brush application. This is an important technique to know about because this is how you're able to use watercolor pencils and arrive at a 100% painterly look. Because yes, you are able to arrive at a certain level of painterly effects because you are able to activate that pigment after it's been applied on paper with a pencil. However, whenever you apply your color or your pigment with pencil or in pencil form, you're bound to be left with at least a small amount of texture. Whereas if you're looking for 100% painterly effects, where you're not left with that texture that is created when you apply pigment on paper with some sort of drawing tool like a pencil, then you should be applying your pigment with a paintbrush. And the way that you do it with watercolor pencils is you apply that pigment via your pencil on a type of palette, whether it's a plastic palette or a paper palette like the one that I am using here. What you do is you apply a good amount of pigment via your pencil on that palette, then you use a paintbrush to activate that pigment on your palette, and you bring out that color using your paintbrush, and that's how you apply your color on your paper. So as you can see, I arrive at a completely painterly look, just like I would if I were using traditional watercolor paint. This first one is a light blue to dark blue gradient. So what I did was I activated that light blue on my paper palette using my paintbrush and a little bit of water. I painted in that light blue section, making my way from left to right, and then I activated the dark blue on my palette and I painted that dark blue in right to left, making sure that I just reached that halfway point with my dark blue. I know that the dark blue would eat up and completely overpower the light blue to the point that I would be left with no light blue if I wasn't careful. So I made sure to just reach that central point with my dark blue. I removed that dark blue from my paintbrush bristles, and then I just pulled a tiny bit more of that dark blue into that lightest area to create a little bit of a gradient. I will be going in 2 layers in these last 2 exercises to intensify the darkest areas and work on my gradients a little bit more. But just like with the previous exercises, I want to make sure that I allow this first layer of paint to dry completely before going back in with a second layer. I'm doing the exact same thing here with this last exercise. This one is a pink to red gradient. Once that first layer in my last 2 exercises had completely dried, I go ahead and add more of my dark blue pigment on my paper palette. I activate that color with my paintbrush and I paint some of that dark blue in, starting in the right edge of this rectangle, and I make my way toward the light blue section, making sure that I continue paying attention to how I'm moving that dark blue pigment on my paper and how much pigment is collecting on my paintbrush bristles. I just want to reach that halfway point, and so whenever I feel that I need to remove that paint from my paintbrush bristles because maybe the dark blue is reaching way too far, I make sure to take a quick second to remove that paint from my bristles and go in with a clean brush to do my final softening of that transition. I do the exact same thing with this final gradient using my red and making my way in toward the pink section. Removing that red from my paintbrush bristles and going back in with a clean brush to do my final softening of that transition. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys.